Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, hidden in places where even the most determined historians fear to tread. And tonight, dear traveler, you and I shall tread there together, stepping softly through corridors of time where dust motes dance in candlelight and parchment crumbles at the slightest touch. And I must warn you, with a gentle smile and perhaps a knowing wink, that you probably won't survive this, not because of any physical danger, of course, but because once you learn what happened to those lost Templar ships, once you feel the weight of that mystery settling into your bones like a comfortable blanket, you may never look at medieval history quite the same way again. And really, isn't that a delightful way to not survive something? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, perhaps leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are, because I find something wonderfully cozy about knowing that someone in Tokyo is drifting off at 3 in the morning, while someone else in London is just beginning to feel drowsy at a sensible 10 o'clock, and it reminds me that history connects us all across time zones, just as surely as it connects us across centuries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, beginning in the heart of Rome, where the Vatican rises against the Italian sky like a monument to secrets kept and truths half told, and you find yourself walking slowly through the apostolic palace, your footsteps echoing softly on marble floors that have witnessed the passage of popes and pilgrims for over 1,000 years, and the air here smells of old incense and older stone, a scent that somehow speaks directly to the drowsy parts of your mind, telling you that here, in these halls, time moves differently, more slowly, more gently, like honey dripping from a wooden spoon. The mainstream historical fact you need to know, the one that grounds our story in the solid earth of documented history, is that on Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Knights Templar throughout his kingdom, an operation so coordinated and so devastating that it essentially ended one of the most powerful military orders in medieval Christendom. And this date, incidentally, is one reason why Friday the 13th carries such superstitious weight, even today, though I suspect the Templars themselves would find our modern triskaidekaphobia rather quaint compared to what they actually experienced on that fateful morning when armed men burst through monastery doors and chapel gates at dawn. But here's the quirky little tidbit that historians don't always mention. The kind of detail that makes you smile even as it makes you think. When Philip's men conducted their inventory of Templar properties after the arrests, they expected to find vast treasures, mountains of gold, legendary relics, perhaps even the Holy Grail itself, but what they actually found was startlingly modest. A few coins here, some silver candlesticks there, nothing remotely matching the legendary Templar wealth, and this has led generations of treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists to ask the obvious question: where did it all go? The scholarly debate that continues to simmer among medieval historians centers on whether the Templars received advance warning of the arrests and managed to move their treasury and most valuable possessions before Philip's men arrived, some arguing that the Pope's own representatives may have leaked information to Templar leadership, while others insist that the arrests were genuinely surprising and that the legendary Templar wealth was always more myth than reality, a kind of medieval fake news that Philip IV himself may have helped spread to justify his seizure of order properties. You walk deeper into the Vatican now, descending a narrow spiral staircase where torchlight flickers against walls that seem to breathe with centuries of accumulated secrets, and each step takes you further from the tourist routes and closer to the archive's most restricted sections, places where documents from the Templar trials have slept undisturbed for centuries, and you can almost hear the stones whispering to each other about what they've witnessed, which is perhaps the most elaborate excuse I've ever made for the sound of old buildings settling. But let's go with it because it adds to the atmosphere. The parchments you find here, handled with cotton gloves because your fingertips contain oils that would eat through medieval vellum faster than a modern teenager through a pizza, reveal fragmentary accounts of Templar activities in the weeks before the arrests, and some of these accounts mention ships, specifically a fleet of vessels that departed from the French port of La Rochelle in late 1307 and were never conclusively seen again, which is rather like saying your eccentric uncle left for the grocery store 18 years ago and hasn't returned, except with more nautical equipment and significantly better organized. The Order of the Temple, you see, was not merely a band of sword-swinging religious knights doing dramatic things in the Holy Land, though they certainly did plenty of that between 1119 and 1291, when Acre fell and the Crusader kingdoms crumbled like stale communion wafers, but rather a sophisticated international organization with financial operations, agricultural holdings, and yes, a significant naval presence that most people forget about when they're busy imagining bearded men in white mantles charging across desert battlefields on magnificent destriers that probably needed quite a lot of water. Speaking of things that seem impractical for desert warfare, the Templar Navy, such as it was, operated primarily in the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast, moving pilgrims, troops, supplies, and increasingly, money, because the Templars had essentially invented international banking, allowing a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem using a system of encrypted receipts that would make modern cybersecurity experts weep with admiration at its elegant simplicity. So when we ask what happened to the lost Templar ships, we're not merely asking about some wooden boats that went missing, like socks in a cosmic dryer. We're asking about vessels that may have carried the accumulated wealth and secrets of an organization that had spent 2 centuries at the intersection of European politics, Islamic scholarship, and sacred mystery, vessels that could have changed hands, changed names, changed history itself in ways we're only beginning to understand. The candle beside you gutters slightly in a draft that seems to come from nowhere, and you pull your imaginary cloak tighter around your shoulders, because even in your mind, the Vatican basements are cool enough to raise goosebumps, and you continue reading by the flickering light, piecing together a narrative that official history has tried very hard to forget, or perhaps, being charitable, simply lost track of amid the chaos of medieval record-keeping, which was never exactly what you'd call comprehensive, though still somehow better than my personal filing system. The documents speak of 18 ships, a number that appears in multiple sources with suspicious consistency, suggesting either that 18 was indeed the accurate count, or that one chronicler made it up, and everyone else just copied his homework, a phenomenon familiar to anyone who's ever compared Wikipedia citations. And these 18 vessels supposedly carried not just cargo but passengers, high-ranking Templars who had received sufficient warning to flee France before Philip's men could clap them in irons and begin asking uncomfortable questions about heresy and mysterious practices, and exactly what was going on during those late-night initiation ceremonies. You lean back for a moment, letting your eyes rest on the dancing shadows that the candle throws against the vaulted ceiling, and you wonder about those men, those knights who stood on ship decks watching the French coastline recede into morning mist, knowing they could never return, knowing that everything they had built and believed in was being systematically destroyed by a king who owed them money and wanted to owe them nothing, not even gratitude. Because Philip IV, let's be honest here, was not what you'd call a model of medieval chivalric virtue, being the kind of man who would destroy an entire religious order rather than repay his debts, which really makes your uncle who borrows $20 and never mentions it again seem almost reasonable by comparison. The Mediterranean at night is not simply dark, it is velvet, and you stand on an imaginary promontory overlooking waters that have carried Phoenician traders, Greek philosophers, Roman legions, and yes, those enigmatic Templar vessels that concern us tonight, and the sound of waves against ancient stone creates a rhythm so old that your heartbeat begins to synchronize with it, slowing, deepening, becoming part of something much larger than yourself, which is a pleasant sensation, and also a convenient excuse if anyone asks why you seem to be dozing during a history video. The port of La Rochelle, where our story truly begins to unfurl its mysterious sails, sits on the Atlantic coast of France rather than the Mediterranean, I should clarify, but the Templars operated in both bodies of water, with the casual competence of an organization that had spent generations learning to move people and goods across dangerous distances, and La Rochelle was their primary Atlantic base, a fortified harbor town where the order maintained extensive facilities including warehouses, workshops, and the kind of naval infrastructure that doesn't just disappear overnight unless someone makes it disappear. Which brings us back to our central mystery with the inevitability of a ship following favorable currents. The mainstream historical fact for this section, properly documented and generally accepted by scholars who have tenure and therefore can admit to finding Templars interesting without risking their careers, is that La Rochelle possessed the largest Templar naval installation on the Atlantic coast, with records indicating the order kept between 12 and 20 vessels based there at any given time, primarily used for transportation and commerce rather than naval warfare, though a Templar ship bristling with armed knights was probably not something pirates approached with enthusiasm, unless those pirates were particularly stupid or particularly desperate, which in medieval times often meant the same thing. Here's your quirky historical tidbit, the kind of detail that makes you appreciate how wonderfully strange the past could be. The Templars apparently operated a primitive form of maritime insurance, whereby a merchant could pay the order a fee and receive compensation if their cargo was lost to storms or pirates, which means the Knights Templar, those austere warriors of Christ, essentially invented the business model that would later make Lloyd's of London fabulously wealthy, and I find something delightfully ironic about holy warriors pioneering financial instruments that today we associate with men in boring suits rather than men in chainmail. The scholarly debate here concerns what records, if any, survive from La Rochelle detailing exactly which ships were present in October 1307, and what happened to them during the suppression, with some historians arguing that French royal officials deliberately destroyed port records to hide evidence of ships escaping, while others maintain that the records simply weren't kept with sufficient detail to answer our questions, a mundane explanation that is probably correct, but significantly less fun at parties. You walk now along the harbor wall, your imagination supplying the creak of wooden hulls, the slap of water against rope-encrusted pilings, and the distant calls of sailors speaking a French so different from the modern language that you would barely recognize it, a rough maritime patois salted with Arabic loanwords from the Crusades, and Spanish influences from coastal trading, and somewhere in this linguistic soup, orders were given, anchors were raised, and ships vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, like prayers ascending toward an uncertain heaven. The night of the escape, if indeed there was an organized escape, and not simply the chaotic dispersal of a panicking organization, would have been planned with military precision by men who had spent their lives planning military operations, men who understood supply lines and strategic retreats, and the crucial importance of leaving no useful intelligence for pursuing enemies, which is why we find so few documents describing exactly what happened, either because those documents were destroyed by the fleeing Templars, destroyed by the pursuing French, or simply never created in the first place, each possibility equally frustrating for historians trying to reconstruct events 7 centuries later, with the same feeling a detective might have investigating a crime scene that's been cleaned by professionals and then weathered by time. The ships themselves were likely cogs, the workhorse vessels of medieval Atlantic commerce, broad-beamed and sturdy with high sides and a single mast carrying a square sail, not fast but reliable, capable of carrying significant cargo in their deep holds and weathering storms that would sink more elegant vessels. And there's something poetic about the Templars fleeing in ships that looked like floating barns rather than sleek warships, because sometimes survival is about practicality rather than style. A lesson I think about every time I see my own sensible sedan parked next to someone's sports car that can't handle snow. You imagine the loading process, conducted by torchlight in the hours before dawn, men carrying chests whose contents we can only guess at, documents certainly, possibly gold and silver, almost certainly relics both genuine and dubious, because the medieval relic trade was approximately as honest as modern diet pill advertising, and perhaps most importantly, people, knights and sergeants and servants, who had cast their lot with an order that was being branded heretical by the most powerful men in Christendom, a branding that meant torture, imprisonment, and potentially death at the stake for those caught, which provides rather strong motivation for not being caught. The smell of tar and hemp rope fills your imaginary nostrils, mixing with the salt breeze and the distant scent of cooking fires from the town that would wake in a few hours to discover its most prominent residents had vanished, and you wonder what the townspeople thought, whether they prayed for the escaped knights or cursed them for bringing royal attention to their quiet harbor, human nature being sufficiently complicated that probably both responses existed simultaneously in the same community, possibly in the same household, possibly in the same conflicted heart. The question that haunts scholars, that has launched dozens of books and thousands of speculative articles, and at least 3 very questionable History Channel documentaries, is simply, where did they go? The Atlantic offers few obvious destinations for fleeing Templars. Portugal, perhaps, where the order maintained strong connections and would eventually be reconstituted under a new name, or Scotland, far enough from French influence to offer safety, and ruled by a king, excommunicated enough not to care about papal condemnations, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere the medieval mind considered the edge of the world, but which we know today, held continents and civilizations that European cartographers were only beginning to suspect existed. The waves continue their eternal rhythm against the ancient stones, and you feel your breathing deepen as you contemplate possibilities that stretch across oceans and centuries, mysteries that have resisted solution for 700 years and may resist for 700 more, which is somehow both frustrating and comforting. because some mysteries are meant to be companions rather than problems to be solved, stories we carry with us, like treasured possessions that grow more valuable with age rather than less. The documents from this period are maddeningly fragmentary, like trying to read a book where every third page has been torn out by someone with a very specific agenda, and what remains often contradicts itself in ways that suggest either multiple truths or multiple fabrications, both equally possible, in an era when every faction had reasons to control the Templar narrative, the French to justify their persecution, the papacy to preserve its authority, surviving Templars to protect their fugitive brethren, and later Romantics to construct legends that satisfied emotional needs that historical accuracy alone could never fill. You turn away from the harbor now, walking slowly up a cobblestone street that exists only in your imagination, but feels solid beneath your feet nonetheless. And the stars overhead are the same stars that guided medieval navigators, the same stars that Templar captains would have studied as they plotted courses toward uncertain destinations. And there's something wonderfully human about navigation by starlight, about trusting your life to pinpricks of light, so distant they might have died before their illumination reached your eyes. A kind of faith that seems appropriate for men who had built their entire existence around faith of another kind. The breeze carries the scent of bread baking somewhere nearby, because even in moments of historical crisis, people still need to eat, still need to prepare for tomorrow, even when tomorrow seems impossibly uncertain. And this small domestic detail grounds the grand narrative in something recognizably human, something you can connect to your own experience of ordinary life continuing stubbornly in the midst of extraordinary circumstances, which is perhaps why history continues to fascinate us, because it reminds us that the people of the past were just as wonderfully, frustratingly, beautifully human as we are today. The fog that wraps around the Scottish coastline is not like other fog, or so it seems tonight, as you travel northward in imagination, following trails that may or may not have been blazed by fleeing Templar ships 6 centuries ago, and this fog carries something ancient in its damp embrace, something that whispers of standing stones and Celtic prayers, and a Christianity that took root here in ways distinctly different from the Roman traditions further south, all of which creates an atmosphere so thick you could spread it on toast, though I wouldn't recommend actually trying that because fog toast sounds neither appetizing nor particularly nutritious. Scotland in 1307 was ruled by Robert the Bruce, a king with problems of his own, engaged in a desperate struggle for independence against English domination, excommunicated by the Pope for the murder of a rival claimant in a church, which is the kind of career decision that tends to complicate one's relationship with ecclesiastical authority, and therefore perfectly positioned to welcome anyone else the Pope happened to be persecuting at the moment, creating a kind of mutual aid society for the excommunicated that would have made excellent dramatic television if medieval Scotland had possessed broadcasting technology, which it did not, settling instead for bardic recitation and extremely aggressive bagpipe music. The mainstream historical fact, anchoring this section to the bedrock of documented history, is that Scottish records from this period show no arrests of Templars, despite explicit papal orders for their detention, a silence that speaks volumes to historians trained to listen for what documents don't say as much as what they do. And while this absence of persecution could simply reflect Scotland's general chaos during the Wars of Independence, it could also indicate deliberate protection of Templar refugees by a crown that found their military expertise useful and their conflict with Rome ideologically convenient. Your quirky historical tidbit for the evening comes from the persistent legend, beloved by Scottish tourist boards and historical novelists alike, that Templar knights fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, appearing at a crucial moment to turn the tide against English forces, a story for which no contemporary evidence exists whatsoever, but which refuses to die despite repeated scholarly debunking, possibly because it's such a satisfying narrative that people prefer it to the messier historical reality. And honestly, who can blame them, because a sudden cavalry charge of mysterious warrior monks is significantly more cinematic than a footnote about troop dispositions. The scholarly debate here is whether the famous Rosslyn Chapel, built roughly a century after the Templar suppression by a family with documented Templar connections, contains encoded references to Templar knowledge and possibly to the final resting place of Templar treasures, a theory popularized by various books and films that historians find somewhere between irritating and hilarious, though they admit that the chapel's carvings are genuinely unusual and difficult to interpret through conventional medieval religious iconography, leaving room for speculation, if not exactly for confirmation. You walk now through a Scottish landscape that exists partly in history and partly in legend, where the boundaries between documented fact and romantic invention have become so blurred that sometimes even scholars can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And the heather beneath your imaginary feet releases a scent that is somehow both sweet and melancholy, appropriate for contemplating the possible fate of men who cross stormy seas only to disappear into the mists of a land not their own, seeking sanctuary in a kingdom that might shelter them or might simply provide a different kind of ending to their story. The Templar properties in Scotland, such as they were, centered on the preceptory at Ballantradoc, now called Temple, a village whose very name preserves a medieval connection that modern residents probably don't think about much as they go about their daily lives, picking up mail and walking dogs, and doing all the ordinary things that people do in places where extraordinary history happened so long ago that it's become part of the background rather than the foreground of existence. The fog thickens as you climb higher into the Pentland Hills, and you can barely see your hand in front of your face, which makes navigation difficult but atmosphere excellent. And somewhere in this grayness, according to legends that historians regard with professional skepticism, Templar knights found refuge in caves and hidden valleys, continuing their traditions in secret, passing down knowledge through generations until it eventually influenced the development of Freemasonry, a connection that Freemasons themselves have sometimes claimed and sometimes denied depending on which fraternity branch you ask, and how many drinks they've had. The sound of water reaches you through the fog, a stream running somewhere nearby with the eternal patience of Scottish waterways that have been carving their courses since glaciers retreated and humans were just beginning to figure out that these islands might be worth settling despite the weather, which tells you something about human optimism if nothing else. You imagine a Templar knight standing where you stand, 700 years ago, breathing the same damp air, hearing the same running water, looking out at the same fog and wondering what would become of him and his brothers, whether their order would survive in some form or vanish entirely, whether anyone would remember their prayers and their sacrifices and their sins because they were human and therefore had sins aplenty, documented extensively by their French persecutors who had strong motivation to exaggerate but probably didn't have to invent from scratch. The Scottish connection to the Templar diaspora remains one of the most debated aspects of this entire mystery, because Scotland genuinely was a place where fugitive Templars could have found refuge, but the lack of documentary evidence makes every claim speculative, and speculation tends to attract embellishment, the way honey attracts bears, until what began as reasonable hypothesis becomes encrusted with treasure maps and secret codes and Dan Brown novels. No offense to Dan Brown, who has made many people interested in medieval history, even if professionals sometimes wish that interest came with slightly better sourcing. The castle that materializes through the fog ahead of you, because in imagination we get to have castles materialize dramatically rather than simply appearing as you walk around a bend, represents Scottish nobility's complicated relationship with both the English crown and the European Church, a relationship of strategic marriages, convenient betrayals, and occasional genuine loyalty that makes Game of Thrones look positively straightforward by comparison, though with significantly less dragons and only slightly less violence. You approach the castle gates, wondering if Templar refugees ever approached similar gates with similar uncertainty, not knowing whether the hands reaching out to them would help or harm, whether the sanctuary promised would be genuine or merely a different form of captivity, and this uncertainty must have been exhausting, month after month, and year after year, of never quite knowing who to trust, which perhaps explains why so many Templars who escaped the initial persecution seem to have vanished so completely, seeking anonymity over prominence, safety over acknowledgement, survival over the recognition that their service to Christendom had earned and their persecution had denied. The fire that burns in the great hall of this imaginary castle, crackling softly and sending shadows dancing up stone walls, provides the kind of warmth that Scottish knights demand, and you settle into a chair that creaks comfortably beneath you, accepting a cup of something warm that steams in the cool air and tastes of heather honey and strong spirits, because medieval Scots understood that certain climates require certain coping mechanisms, and central heating wouldn't be invented for several centuries yet. The conversation in the hall swirls around you in accents thick enough to require translation even for native English speakers, and you catch fragments about cattle raids and border disputes, and a young king fighting to establish a nation against impossible odds, ordinary concerns of ordinary people living through what would later be recognized as historically significant times, which is always how it works. Historical significance being something we assign retrospectively to moments that felt merely chaotic and uncertain to those actually living through them. The edge of the medieval world was not a line on a map, but a fading into uncertainty, a place where the known gave way to the unknown, and where cartographers wrote, "Here be dragons," not because they believed in dragons necessarily, but because they had to write something, and admitting ignorance felt somehow worse than suggesting monsters, and tonight we sail toward that edge, alongside Templar ships that may or may not have actually made this journey, pursuing a possibility that has tantalized researchers for decades and will probably continue to tantalize them for decades more. The Atlantic Ocean in late autumn is not a gentle body of water. It is a gray, heaving mass of waves that seem personally offended by the presence of wooden ships, and any vessel attempting to cross it in 1307 would have faced conditions that make modern cruise ship passengers' complaints about rough seas seem rather precious by comparison, because medieval ships had no stabilizers, no weather satellites, no GPS, nothing but sail and oar, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors who had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, assuming those predecessors survived long enough to pass on their hard-won knowledge. The mainstream historical fact for this final section of our journey is that the Templars maintained contacts with Portugal's maritime traditions, connections that would influence the later Portuguese voyages of discovery, and the Order of Christ, formed from Portuguese Templars who escaped suppression under a conveniently renamed organization, would fly their distinctive cross on the sails of ships that explored the African coast and eventually reached India, meaning that Templar maritime expertise contributed directly to the age of exploration, even if the order itself had officially ceased to exist, which is a rather elegant form of institutional immortality when you think about it. Your quirky historical tidbit tonight is particularly quirky, concerning a Portuguese-flagged ship that allegedly arrived in Scotland in 1398 under the command of the Sinclair family, who had documented Templar connections, on a voyage that some researchers believe reached North America nearly a century before Columbus, a claim supported by disputed runic inscriptions and architectural similarities that professional archaeologists largely dismiss but which refuse to vanish entirely from popular historical imagination, much like the Templars themselves. The scholarly debate we must acknowledge here is the most contentious of all, whether any Templar ships, after leaving La Rochelle, actually attempted to cross the Atlantic to lands that European merchants and sailors knew existed from Norse accounts and fishing reports, but had not yet officially discovered, a hypothesis that mainstream historians consider extremely unlikely, given the navigational challenges and the complete lack of documentary evidence, but which persistent researchers continue to investigate, using archaeological techniques and documentary analysis that occasionally produces suggestive if not conclusive results. You stand on the deck of an imaginary ship now, an imaginary Templar ship if you prefer, feeling the roll of the Atlantic beneath your feet and watching the horizon where sea meets sky in a line so sharp it seems impossible that anything could exist beyond it. And yet you know, with the benefit of 7 centuries of additional history, that beyond that horizon lie continents and cultures and possibilities that the men who may have sailed these waters could only dimly imagine, possibilities that included not just survival but transformation, the chance to begin again in a land where papal condemnations meant nothing, and French kings held no power. The cold spray hits your face like tiny needles of ice, shocking you into wakefulness for a moment, before the rhythm of the waves lulls you back toward drowsiness, because even adventure can become monotonous when adventure consists of day after day of gray water and gray sky, and the same faces gathered around the same small fires, cooking the same inadequate meals, and you wonder if the Templars on these ships, if they existed, found themselves bored between moments of terror, which seems to be the pattern of most sea voyages throughout history, tedium punctuated by occasional desperate action. The theories about Templar voyages to America range from the relatively sober, suggesting that Templars may have joined existing fishing expeditions to Newfoundland, where European cod fishermen had been quietly working for generations, to the extravagantly speculative, involving buried treasures on Oak Island and pre-Columbian towers in Newport, and carved maps on cathedral walls that allegedly reveal secret transatlantic routes. And I present these theories not because I believe them all, but because they form part of the cultural afterlife of the Templars, the way societies continue to tell stories about organizations that officially ended centuries ago, finding in those stories something we need that mere documented history doesn't provide. The treasure question inevitably arises when discussing possible Templar voyages, because treasure is what most people imagine when they imagine secret fleets vanishing from European ports, chests of gold and silver, and possibly religious relics of incalculable value. And while sober historians point out that the Templars' wealth was primarily in land and financial instruments rather than portable bullion, the romantic image persists supported by the genuine mystery of why French investigators found so little portable wealth when they seized Templar properties, a discrepancy that must have some explanation, even if that explanation is more mundane than hidden fleets sailing toward American shores. You find yourself below decks now, in the cramped sleeping quarters where men rest in hammocks that swing with the ship's motion, creating a gentle cradle effect that your tired body finds deeply appealing. And the smell here is of salt and unwashed humanity, and the tarred ropes that keep the vessel waterproof, an overwhelming sensory experience that medieval sailors simply accepted as the cost of their profession, their noses long since deadened to odors that would send modern noses into revolt. And yet there's something almost cozy about this cramped space, something womb-like about the wooden walls curving around you and the rhythmic creaking that becomes a kind of lullaby after enough days at sea. The navigation techniques of medieval Atlantic sailors relied on accumulated practical knowledge rather than precise instruments, reading cloud formations and bird migrations, and the color of the water, and 100 other subtle signs that modern navigators with their electronic equipment would never think to observe. Knowledge passed down through generations of sailors who learned their trade by doing it, by surviving voyages that killed many of their contemporaries, by developing intuitions that we might today call pattern recognition, but which they probably just called knowing how to sail. And this knowledge could absolutely have guided ships to American shores if anyone had the motivation and the resources to attempt such a crossing, which the fleeing Templars might have possessed in abundance. The stars emerge as clouds part briefly overhead, and you recognize constellations that guided Mediterranean voyages for millennia, Polaris holding steady in the north while other stars wheel around it in their eternal dance, and you think about how those same stars shone on Templar ships that definitely existed, and may or may not have carried their passengers to destinations that we can only guess at, destinations that history swallowed so completely that we're left with nothing but questions and theories, and the enduring human desire to know what really happened to people who vanished into the unknown, whether that unknown was the fog of Scotland or the vastness of the Atlantic or something else entirely that we haven't yet considered. The voyage in your imagination could end anywhere, on American shores where indigenous peoples might have observed strange ships with strange people and wondered what the gods were sending them now, or on the bottom of the Atlantic where storms and navigation errors sent ships to watery graves that have never been found and may never be, or simply nowhere special, medieval fishing grounds where Templars quietly joined existing communities and lived out their days as ordinary fishermen, their extraordinary history becoming just another family story that faded over generations until it was forgotten entirely. And perhaps that last possibility is the most likely, even if it's the least satisfying, because history is full of dramatic beginnings that lead to mundane endings, and there's something almost comforting about imagining Templar knights growing old, mending nets, and telling their grandchildren stories that those grandchildren half believed and eventually forgot. As we settle deeper into this evening's embrace, let us gather the threads we've woven across these hours and hold them gently, examining how they connect and what patterns they form when viewed together rather than separately. We began in the Vatican's shadowed archives, where candlelight revealed fragments of a story that official history has never quite managed to tell completely, and we learned that the arrest of the Knights Templar on Friday, October 13, 1307, was not merely a legal action, but a kind of historical earthquake whose aftershocks continue to ripple through our understanding of medieval Europe. The documents we examined there, those fragile parchments that crumble at a careless touch, spoke of ships that departed from La Rochelle in the darkness before dawn, vessels that carried passengers and cargo into an uncertainty that has never been fully resolved. And this uncertainty is not a flaw in the historical record, but rather one of its most fascinating features, a reminder that the past is not a completed puzzle, but an ongoing conversation between evidence and interpretation. The journey then took us to Mediterranean and Atlantic ports, where the Templar naval presence, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic cavalry charges and castle sieges, revealed itself as a sophisticated operation involving insurance mechanisms, international commerce, and the movement of pilgrims and goods across distances that seemed immense to medieval travelers. We stood on harbor walls and smelled tar and hemp, and heard the creak of wooden hulls against stone pilings, and we imagined the loading of those mysterious 18 ships in the hours before Philip's men could close the trap, men carrying chests whose contents continue to fuel speculation 7 centuries later. The quirky detail about Templars essentially inventing maritime insurance reminds us that this organization was not merely about sword and prayer, but about practical innovation in service of their mission, a kind of holy capitalism that makes them seem surprisingly modern despite their medieval context. Scotland received us next, wrapped in fog so thick it seemed to muffle even our imaginary footsteps, and there we encountered Robert the Bruce's excommunicated kingdom, where papal orders meant little, and fugitive Templars might have found welcome among allies who shared their complicated relationship with Roman authority. The silence of Scottish records regarding Templar arrests speaks as loudly as any documented prosecution, suggesting either deliberate protection or convenient chaos, both equally plausible in a kingdom fighting for its very existence. We walked through the Pentland Hills and approached castles that materialized through mist, imagining knights who had crossed stormy seas, finding themselves in landscapes so different from the Mediterranean shores where their order had been born, adapting or failing to adapt, surviving or vanishing into anonymity that has frustrated researchers ever since. The final leg of our voyage carried us beyond the edge of medieval maps, toward horizons that cartographers filled with dragons rather than admit their ignorance, and we contemplated the possibility that some Templar ships did not merely flee to Scotland or Portugal, but continued westward toward lands that Europeans knew existed but had not yet claimed. This most speculative portion of our narrative reminds us that the boundary between documented history and legendary possibility is not always clear, that researchers continue to debate evidence that might indicate medieval European contact with America, and that the human desire to solve mysteries sometimes leads us to see patterns that may not exist while other patterns remain invisible to our searching eyes. Throughout this journey, we have encountered not just facts but the absence of facts, the gaps in the record that invite speculation and resist closure, and these gaps are perhaps the most important feature of the Templar story, because they remind us that history is never complete, that documents decay, and memories fade, and deliberate destruction erases what inconvenient parties prefer forgotten. The Templars themselves understood this, understood that controlling information could be as important as controlling territory, and perhaps their most lasting legacy is not any treasure buried on some distant shore, but the mystery itself, the questions that continue to draw researchers and dreamers 700 years after the last official Templar faced his accusers in a French dungeon. The historical significance of the Knights Templar extends far beyond their dramatic end, encompassing innovations in banking and finance that shaped European commerce for centuries, military techniques that influenced Crusader and Islamic forces alike, and organizational structures that provided models for later religious and secular institutions. When we ask what happened to the lost ships, we are also asking what happened to the knowledge they carried, the traditions they preserved, the possibilities they represented, and these questions matter not because we expect definitive answers, but because the asking itself connects us to generations of previous askers, creating a community of curiosity that spans centuries and continents. The candles that lit our Vatican research, the harbor waves that rocked our imaginary observations, the Scottish fog that wrapped around our explorations, the Atlantic spray that touched our faces on the final voyage. These sensory details anchor abstract history and physical experience, reminding us that the past happened to real people with real bodies, who felt cold and tasted salt, and grew tired and dreamed of destinations they might never reach. As we prepare to rest, we carry these sensory memories with us, along with the questions they provoke and the possibilities they suggest, because good history does not merely inform but transforms, changing how we see not just the past but the present that grew from it. And now, as our journey draws toward its gentle close, you find yourself returning to the present moment, to wherever you are listening, to whatever soft surface supports your increasingly heavy body, and the transition feels natural, like a ship entering harbor after long voyaging, the motion gradually stilling, the urgency gradually fading, replaced by something quieter and deeper and infinitely more restful. The candlelight that guided our Vatican research seems to flicker one last time before settling into a steady glow, warm and golden, and somehow reassuring, and you realize that you can carry that light with you into sleep, a small flame of curiosity that will still be burning when you wake, ready to illuminate whatever mysteries tomorrow presents. The stone corridors we walked together, those passages beneath ancient buildings where secrets accumulated like dust in corners, stretch out in your memory like paths through a peaceful garden, and you can return to them whenever you wish, in dreams or in waking imagination, because the past is always available to those who know how to look for it. The smell of old parchment and older incense lingers at the edges of your awareness, not unpleasant, but quietly present, a reminder that knowledge has weight and texture and scent, that learning is a full-body experience, even when we imagine it happening only in our minds. The harbor waters that lapped against medieval pilings continue their rhythm somewhere in your consciousness. a sound like breathing, like heartbeats, like the fundamental pulse of the living world that persists whether we attend to it or not. And this rhythm can carry you now, gently, inevitably, toward the shores of sleep where other voyages await you. The Templar ships that vanished into uncertainty have found their way to your dreams, perhaps, carrying their mysterious cargoes to destinations that only sleeping minds can reach, and there is nothing frightening in this, only the continuing adventure of consciousness, exploring territories that waking reason cannot map. If you have traveled this far with me, through Vatican archives and Mediterranean ports and Scottish fog and Atlantic horizons, then I hope you have found something valuable in the journey, not just historical information, but something harder to name, a sense of connection perhaps, or wonder, or simply the pleasant exhaustion that comes from sustained imaginative effort. This is why I create these journeys, why I research and write and record, because I believe that history at bedtime is a special kind of magic, transforming the acquisition of knowledge into a gentle ritual that honors both the mind's hunger for understanding and the body's need for rest. If you genuinely enjoyed what we shared tonight, I would be grateful if you would consider subscribing to this channel, because your subscription tells me that these journeys matter to someone besides myself, that the hours of research and writing find their way to minds and hearts that welcome them. Alike, if you feel moved to offer one, helps other seekers find their way here, creates pathways through the vast wilderness of online content to this particular clearing where history and sleep intertwine. And if you know someone who might benefit from gentle historical narratives as they drift toward dreams, perhaps you might share this video with them, extending our small community by one more curious soul. But these requests are secondary to my primary hope, which is simply that you rest well tonight, that whatever anxieties or frustrations or unanswered questions you carried into this evening have loosened their grip somewhat, that the weight of tomorrow feels slightly lighter than it did before we began. The Templars understood something about the relationship between duty and rest, between the active life of service and the contemplative life of prayer, and perhaps we can learn from them that productivity and peace are not opposites but partners, that we serve best when we also allow ourselves to be restored. Your eyes are heavy now, or growing heavier, and there is no need to resist this natural progression, no need to fight the gentle undertow that pulls you toward sleep's welcoming depths. The Scottish fog that wrapped around our exploration wraps around you too, soft and cool and somehow protective, muffling the sharp edges of consciousness until everything feels rounded and safe and infinitely comfortable. The fire in the great hall still burns somewhere in your imagination, crackling softly, sending warmth toward wherever you rest, and you can imagine its light playing across your closed eyelids, patterns that mean nothing and everything, abstract art created by ancient elements for an audience of one. The questions we explored tonight will still be questions tomorrow, still be questions 100 years from now. And there is something peaceful in this, something that releases us from the pressure to solve everything immediately, that allows us to hold uncertainty as a companion rather than an enemy. The Templar ships may have reached America, or Scotland, or the bottom of the Atlantic or somewhere we have not yet imagined, and not knowing does not diminish us, but connects us to generations of wanderers who came before and will come after, all of us looking at the same stars, asking the same questions, finding comfort in the asking itself. Let your breathing deepen now. Let each exhale carry away some small tension you no longer need. Let each inhale bring the peace that patient inquiry brings, the peace of knowing that curiosity itself is its own reward, that the journey matters more than the destination, that tonight's exploration was complete in itself, regardless of what conclusions we reached or failed to reach. The knights who sailed from La Rochelle would understand this, would recognize the faith required to voyage toward uncertain horizons, the courage to proceed without guaranteed outcomes, the grace to accept whatever shores finally receive us. Sleep approaches like a friendly ship entering harbor, its sails full of dreams, its hold full of rest, and you are welcome aboard, welcome to whatever voyage awaits you in that other country, where logic loosens and imagination rules, and the Templars sail forever toward destinations that shift and shimmer and never quite resolve into solid ground. May your dreams be kind ones, may your rest be deep, may you wake refreshed and ready and curious about what other mysteries await our exploration together. The candle gutters now, the flame bowing toward darkness but not yet extinguished, never entirely extinguished, as long as someone somewhere continues to ask questions and seek understanding. Good night, dear traveler. Good night from the Vatican archives. Good night from the Mediterranean harbors. Good night from the Scottish hills. Good night from the Atlantic waves. Good night from all the centuries we visited together. Until next time, rest well. End of script. Sweet dreams.